Okay. This is an interview with Stanley Lowell in the Days Inn, Hicksville, New York, the 17th of July, 2003, approximately 9 a.m. The interviewers are Mike Russert and Wayne Clark. Could you give us your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
My name is Stanley Lowell. I was born May 30th, 1921 in Brooklyn, New York.
What was your educational background prior to entering the military service?
I went, of course, graduated high school, and I started college at Brooklyn College, CCNY, in New York City, and I attended for about a year, maybe a little bit more, a little less, thereabouts. And then I dropped out of school because I lived in Far Rockaway, New York, and it was a 5-hour commute to and from college, which became absolutely abhorrent to me, and I dropped out.
Okay. Did you enlist or were you drafted?
I enlisted.
Why did you enlist in the Army Air Corps?
Well, I always had a desire to be an airplane pilot, although I had never even been in an airplane. It was a lifelong dream that one day I would be an airplane pilot. And I enlisted because I realized that with the war in progress, I would undoubtedly be drafted, and the thought of serving in the infantry seemed very unpleasant.
Okay. Where did you go when did you enlist and where did you go for your training?
I enlisted I believe it was, I really don't remember. It must have been 1943.
Okay, you wrote down February of 43.
Yeah.
Okay.
And my training was accomplished in the Southeast Air Force Training Command.
Where was that?
It was started in Montgomery, Alabama, Maxwell Field. It went on to Cape Girardeau, Missouri, Walnut Ridge, Arkansas, Seymour, Indiana, and then after graduating as a pilot, I had additional training in B-17s and the development of a combat crew in Florida, at Sebring and in Tampa.
When did you pick up your crew?
I picked up my crew. See, I don't remember the dates.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah, I picked up my crew at Tampa after I completed B-17 training, and each member of the crew had been trained in a specific specialty. An engineer, an armorer. They each had a specific training area, and then it became my responsibility to meld them into a fighting unit.
Did you maintain the same crew during the entire time you were...
Mainly. When we were ready to leave for overseas, one of the crew, we had been home on leave, and one of the crew did not show up. So instead of being 10 men, we were only 9, and I was told that this man had decided that he would not continue as a flight crew member. He withdrew from flying. Also, when we were flying the mission that we were shot down in, that man had been replaced, and one of my other crew members was sick that day, or for some reason could not fly. So I had one person who I did not know.
Okay. Where did you pick your plane up, and how did you get over to England?
Okay, we picked the plane up at Hunter Field in Georgia, and I flew the airplane over to England,
What route did you take?
North Atlantic.
Approximately how long?
Well, there's some interesting stories that happened on the way. For one, we were en route when we received a call advising us to divert to Grenier Field, New Hampshire, because the weather over the North Atlantic had deteriorated very badly. So we went to Grenier Field, and then we remained there for several days, and then we left for Reykjavik, Iceland, and the weather report was for good weather. As it turned out, it was solid overcast. We flew on solid instruments from the time we got over the ocean until we finally landed at Reykjavik. The navigator became lost because he could not see the stars to take a celestial shot, and he could not even see the waves under us. We couldn't get low enough to get under, so that he could not get a wind drift. And as a result, we were forced to utilize radio navigation as we got close to Reykjavik, to arrive at Reykjavik, even though we had been warned not to rely upon radio navigation because the Germans were putting submarines out in the North Sea on the same frequency. And it was very possible that you would tune in the submarine thinking it was Reykjavik and end up over the North Sea running out of fuel. But the conditions were such that when we did turn the radios on, we found the Reykjavik was off to our left, whereas if it had been a submarine, it probably would have been someplace in front of us out in the North Sea. And we had no alternative. So we utilized the radio signals, and we arrived at Reykjavik, where we almost flew into the ocean. But that's another story.
Where were you based in England?
I was based at a place called Deetham Green. It was a B-17 base, about 90 miles northeast of London, near the White Cliffs of Dover.
Did you keep the same plane in most of your missions?
No, I did not. I was a replacement crew. And as replacement crews, we were assigned any aircraft that was available.
So you never got to name a plane?
Never got to name a plane.
Did you ever decorate your jackets at all? Or?
No. We were there a very short time. I arrived in England the middle of May, and I was shot down May 29th.
That was 1744?
44. So I had approximately 2 weeks of combat, during which we flew all our missions. And
how many missions did you have in that period?
I was on my 5th mission, I believe it was. And it was just before the invasion of Europe, which was on June 6th or 7th. And so everything that could fly was being flown those couple of weeks before the invasion.
Where was your first mission to? Where was
the first mission was a short mission. I believe it was to Liège, Belgium. And the first mission as a B-17 commander, I flew as a co-pilot. And that was the training I got for combat. My crew did not fly that mission. And then subsequently I flew with my own crew.
What was your mission on your fifth?
The mission I was shot down on was a mission to Leipzig, Germany.
Mhm.
And it was a long one. If you'd like to hear about
Yes.
it.
Yes,
definitely.
that's what. What is a long mission?
8-9 hours in the air. And I could probably read it to you with much more accuracy than tell you about it, if you would like to hear it. Would that be satisfactory?
It's up to you.
Yeah. Now, did you wear your flak jacket?
I don't remember. I probably did.
Did you have fighter escorts?
We had fighter escort for part of the way. Okay. On May 29th, the day of that last mission, I was awakened by an orderly about 4:30 a.m. After dressing, we went to the Squadron dining room for a large breakfast, which included scrambled eggs, sausage, chipped beef on toast, fried potatoes, and lots of coffee. We each ate as much as our individual state of anxiety would permit. We knew that it might be a long time before we ate anything other than a candy bar if the day's mission was a long one. I, of course, was unaware that the war in Europe would be over, and 11 months would have passed before I returned to Allied control. After breakfast, I replaced my uniform with flying clothes, including sheepskin outer garments and sheepskin boots, over my regular shoes. I replaced my Hebrew dog tags with new ones which indicated my religion as Protestant. I then went to the briefing room for information on the day's mission. There we learned that the target for the day was Leipzig, deep in the heart of Germany. And then there's things we were told that I won't.
Well, let me just ask you something. Was it common for people of the Jewish faith to switch dog tags like that?
No, it was not. It was something I decided on my own that I would do. And I think I can truthfully say I would not be alive today had I not done it. And I am surprised that it was not done by all Jewish airmen.
Well, we've heard similar stories where as soon as they landed, they got rid of the dog tag.
But that's suspicious when you don't have dog tags, when they capture you. If you don't have dog tags, why don't you have them? Okay. Shortly after dawn, we taxied our aircraft to the runway in use. The takeoff and climb to top of the clouds was routine. Once on top of the clouds, we were busy identifying the squadron's colored flares and getting into assigned battle positions without colliding with other B-17s trying to do the same thing. After the better part of an hour, all aircraft were in their assigned positions and we headed for the continent. Over the English Channel, all the gunners tested their guns, and our aircraft shook and shuddered from the recoil of all the guns. All firing ceased as we crossed the French coast, which at that time was Germany, where we encountered the usual anti-aircraft fire. As far as I could see, their fire this day was ineffectual. Numerous fighter support aircraft protected us for about the first 2 hours after the coast, but then had to return to England because of their fuel limitations. For the next couple of hours, the mission of hundreds of B-17s droned down at high altitude between 25,000 and 30,000 feet. Everything was very calm. The frozen vapor trails left by the aircraft were beautiful to observe with the sky above them. Amidst the beauty and the calm, the tension of every crew member was intense as they continually kept scanning the sky for any sign of enemy aircraft. It was very cold, even in the cockpit where we had heaters. In the waist and tail of the aircraft, where there are no heaters and the gun windows are open to the outside, the temperature was about 40 degrees below zero, and the crew would have died from the temperature without the protective clothing they were wearing. When our squadron was about 50 miles west of Leipzig, we were attacked by enemy fighters. The attack came from directly in front of us, and the German Focke-Wulf 190s passed right through our formation. I cannot estimate how many German fighters were attacking us, for my concentration was upon those in close proximity which constituted a danger to us. However, I was aware of 2 formations of 3 aircraft each flying through our formation. It was terrifying to have enemy fighters coming at us with a closure rate of more than 600 miles per hour with lights like modern-day strobe lights blinking in their wings. It was many more times frightening when it was realized that the blinking lights were 20-millimeter cannon, and it seemed they were all firing directly at me. As the enemy planes hurtled past, I could see the German pilots' faces, and I could feel my aircraft shake and shudder from the recoil of all of our guns firing at the enemy. After passing through our squadron, the Germans circled out of reach of our guns and attacked twice more from dead ahead. Each time they came through the formation, B-17s could be seen burning and going down out of control, with parts of the aircraft shot to pieces. Fortunately, some of our aircraft were able to bail out, and I did not see anyone in a parachute come under attack. The attack upon us also proved costly to the enemy. Our gunners were successful in shooting down a few enemy fighters. I saw one go down trailing smoke, while others went down out of control. After passing the point from which the bomb run commences, our bomb bay doors were opened. At that time, we were about 3 minutes flying time to the target. Each aircraft in every formation made sure that he was not under an aircraft above him, for we were area bombing, which meant that when the lead bombardier, using the Norden bomb sight, dropped his bombs, every other bombardier in the squadron hit a switch to drop his plane's bombs. As we approached the target, in addition to encountering anti-aircraft fire from the ground, we were under enemy aircraft attack. Suddenly, as we were almost over the target, I noticed smoke coming out of the 2 engines on my left. Then, moments later, flames could be seen coming out of the cowlings of the engines. When I saw the smoke and then flames, my heart skipped a few beats. Calmly, without feeling fear, I thought, oh no, we're dead. By that time, we were over the target. I saw the bombs fall from the lead aircraft, and our bombardier dropped our bomb load. I yelled at Ted, who was the co-pilot, "We're on fire, port, left engines." As we continued our pre-planned target departure route, Ted and I became extremely busy for several seconds. I shouted at him, "Feather the propellers of the 2 engines on fire." He did, and I then stopped the fuel flow to those 2 engines and yelled into the co-pilot intercom, "Fire extinguishers." Ted instantly activated the carbon dioxide fire extinguishers inside the nacelles of the 2 burning engines. I could see the fire diminish, but I could also see the extinguishers were not going to put the fire out. I therefore put the aircraft into a steep dive, hoping the rush of air would blow the fire out in both engines. The dive was so steep and fast that the aircraft was, within moments, exceeding the red line maximum speed of the B-17. We were lucky. The rush of wind did what we hoped and blew the remaining fire out. While Ted and I were trying to save the ship, neither one of us thought about or had the time to tell the crew in the back of the aircraft what was happening. And so when we came out of the dive, I was surprised that none of the crew had bailed out without being given the order to do so. With the fire out, our best chance of survival was to rejoin the B-17 group flying thousands of feet above us. The enemy fighters were no longer a factor because, having inflicted maximum damage upon us prior to the bomb drop, they were now nowhere in sight. With the enemy fighters gone, the ground and aircraft batteries increased the number of shells being fired at the group above us. The sky turned black with flak bursts. The puffs of smoke appeared harmless, which of course they were not, as attested to by the few aircraft which were hit. During the entire air battle, I remembered trying to compress myself into the smallest of targets. Because of the heavy ground fire and because the mission had been accomplished, our group was proceeding away from the target and flak slightly faster than normal. With 2 engines out of service, we were having difficulty in climbing back to their altitude. We were unable to keep up with them. I broke radio silence since the Germans knew exactly where we were, and I requested group leader, how about slowing down so the crippled aircraft can keep up? The group leader replied, aircraft requesting group to reduce speed, drop back and join following groups. Joining with other B-17s was essential, for a lone B-17, even if not wounded, would be easy prey for any German fighter. As we continued to drop back from squadron to squadron, I took inventory. I ascertained that none of my crew was injured, and that aside from the 2 propellers being feathered, the aircraft was sound. A feather propeller is one which has been stopped with the blades turned so that they offer the least drag. We continued to drop back until we were all alone in the sky. Thank God, no enemy fighters appeared. At that time, I considered diverting to Switzerland, which was closer than England. If we could reach Switzerland, we would be interned for the rest of the war, and that would be much more desirable than becoming prisoners of war, assuming we were not all killed before the day was over. However, being young and not wanting to be out of the war yet, I decided to try and get back to England. Another factor in my decision was that I was not sure that the aircraft could maintain enough altitude with 2 engines feathered to get over the Alps mountains in southern Germany and in Switzerland. Shall I continue?
Sure.
Fortunately, no German fighters appeared, and we limped along toward England, slowly losing altitude on just 2 engines. I ordered the crew to lighten the aircraft by throwing everything they could out of the aircraft because of the steady, slow loss of altitude. All guns, ammunition, and all else that was loose or could be loosened was thrown overboard. We reached a point where I was almost able to stop the loss of altitude without using excess power. In the lull in activity, while the crew was in the progress of unbolting the 2,000-pound ball turret so that it would fall out of the belly of the aircraft, a sense of fear overcame me as I realized that we all would probably die within the next few hours. I became very conscious of the fact that we were flying over Hitler's Germany in a crippled B-17 at slow speed at medium altitude. We now did not even have guns with which to protect ourselves, for they had been tossed out of the aircraft. My training did pay off at that time, as I became conscious of the fact that as the airplane commander, my responsibility was to remain calm, keep my crew from panic, and if possible, get us home. In the preceding 30 minutes or so, we had been in an aerial battle, flown through a very heavy flak barrage, been on fire, lost the use of 2 engines, dropped back squadron to squadron, until we were now alone over the heart of Germany, flying in a crippled aircraft. It therefore became necessary to provide our own navigation back to England and around areas of known flak concentration depicted on flak charts. I therefore called our navigator on the intercom, intending to find out our present position and to discuss headings for the shortest or safest route back to England. Up to that time, I had been heading in a westerly direction, knowing that was the general heading we needed. Instead of the navigator answering my call, I was answered by the bombardier. The navigator and bombardier share the nose compartment on the B-17. Bellamy, the bombardier, advised me that soon after we were hit and started to burn, the navigator had gone into shock and that he was unable to perform his duties. He also advised me that he, the bombardier, would do the navigating. The problem was that we did not have a starting point, for we did not know exactly where we were. We made an educated guess as to our position based upon headings I had flown after the target, which was our last known position, and estimates of the amount of time we had been on each of the headings. While we knew our calculations were not accurate, we were quite certain we would not miss England. About 10 minutes later, still having difficulty holding my altitude without use of excessive power, I called the flight engineer on the intercom to find out if there was anything else that could be jettisoned. He told me we still had the ball turret. He told me that all the bolts had been removed except one, and that one was out except for the last few turns, but that the crew did not want to waste the 2,000-pound weight, so they were waiting until we were over a town before performing the last turn on the bolt. I ordered them to drop the turret immediately. They did, and I was then able to maintain altitude with an acceptable power setting. After flying for about 20 minutes on a heading toward England at medium altitude, we all began to relax a little, and our hope of survival increased. While on the heading toward England, a town loomed up ahead of us. The bombardier said he had checked our flak charts and that the town had no anti-aircraft guns. We therefore decided not to alter course, and we started to overfly the town. Well, either we had the wrong town identified, or the Germans had moved many anti-aircraft 88mm guns into the town. In either event, when about one halfway across the town, a heavy barrage of anti-aircraft fire commenced. We were an easy target at medium altitude, slow speed, and limited maneuverability because of our crippled condition. One of the first shells fired struck our aircraft in the bomb bay, which is located between the pilot's cockpit and the radio room. The force of the explosion seemed to have been in 3 directions. The shell blew out part of the 2 sides of the bomb bay, It also blew open the bomb bay doors, which added to the wind drag. Fortunately, the bomb bay was empty. If it had contained any bombs, we would have been blasted to bits. As soon as the anti-aircraft fire began, a base of action consisting of sharp, erratic turns of varying degrees was commenced. Constant altitude changes were also affected. In my desperation, adrenaline pumping, I performed violent evasive actions I doubt I would have had the strength to accomplish even in a healthy B-17. Luckily, the main spars or beams which run through the top and bottom of the bomb bay were not severed by the blast, and they held the front and the rear of the aircraft together. We also were very lucky that no one was injured in the explosion or the violent evasive action I was forced to take. As we left the area where we had all almost died, I turned to Ted, the co-pilot, and since our oxygen masks were now off at medium altitude, I said to him, "We are never going to make it back to England if we stay at medium altitude. We are too vulnerable to ground fire. Any enemy aircraft within 20 miles can easily spot us. And if the Germans have any radar in the area, they can easily vector fighters to us." Ted replied, "I agree, but there's no place we can hide." I remember then saying to him, "I think we should take it down to just above the treetops. At that altitude, we would be below any German radar coverage. We would be gone from visual sight if we passed over or close to any ground guns before they could get a shot off. And also, remember how difficult it is to sight an aircraft below you when it is close to the ground." Ted agreed by saying, "Let's take it down." He then advised the crew what we were doing. Needless to say, we zigzagged quite a bit so that anyone on the ground who spied us could not accurately alert weapons ahead of us. The erratic course we flew made our distance to England much longer, but we felt it increased our chance of survival, and we were not short of fuel. We flew so low that we had to pull up to clear even slight elevations. For the next couple of hours, we continued our slow flight to England. Things were looking good. The two operating engines were performing fine. We encountered no enemy gunfire or fighters. It was spring, May 29th, 1944, and everything below us was blooming. At our low altitude, we could even smell the earth below us. The countryside was quite beautiful, and from our altitude of about 100 feet, we had an excellent bird's eye view. We felt optimistic. We were going to make it back to England. As we estimated that we were approaching the coast, I don't want to read that. While aware only generally of our current position, we knew that a heading north of west would get us to England. During this portion of our flight, we were of course not wearing our oxygen masks. Most of the crew had discarded their sheepskin flight clothes. Everyone was hopeful and optimistic. All eyes aboard were searching forward for a sight of the English Channel. Suddenly, a stream of black smoke began to trail behind the rear of the remaining operational inboard engine. I recognized that the stream of black smoke was in reality oil. We had broken an oil line or oil connection. Apparently, the strain on the engines for a protracted period soon after we were hit had been too much for them, and we were in the process of losing our third engine. Since the B-17 cannot operate on one engine and hold its altitude, and because we were too low to bail out, it became necessary to set the B-17 down in a crash landing. I remember that at the time I felt very calm. I believed that I was going to my death. I felt that it did not matter to me personally if the airplane crashed and I was killed, or if we were fortunate enough to survive the imminent crash and I was killed by the Germans because of my religion. However, my feeling was that I owed my best efforts to the crew members who were depending on me for their lives, even if those lives were to be as prisoners. Because I had been piloting a semi-disabled aircraft at altitudes which were too low to permit the use of a parachute, I had been noting possible emergency landing spots during the entire low-altitude portion of our flight. I therefore remembered that less than a minute ago we had passed a small town with cleared fields around it. Some of the fields had appeared large enough to accommodate an emergency short-field B-17 landing. I immediately made a 180-degree turn to the right to reverse course, and I headed for the largest field I had noticed. Ted, the co-pilot, alerted the crew to assume crash positions, and I prayed that the engine losing oil would continue to run until I reached the selected field. My prayer was answered, and as we cleared the trees at the edge of the field, I cut off the power on the engines and turned off the ignition switches to prevent fire, as I called for Ted to cut the fuel to those two engines. We were committed to land. There was no possibility of a second try. The aircraft settled slowly onto the field with flaps extended, wheels up, and bomb bay doors stuck out beneath the aircraft. We must have initially acted as a plow with the bomb bay doors extended beneath the aircraft. We plowed, slid, skidded, and prayed as we progressed across the field, raising such dust that it was impossible to see anything. And I'll stop it there.
All right, and
So,
from your own recollections, what happened then?
Oh. Well, then I might as well read on.
Oh.
Okay? Would you rather ask questions
yeah, I think maybe,
rather than read?
yeah, was anyone injured on the landing?
Nobody was injured in the landing.
Mhm.
When we got out of the airplane, well, first of all, you have to correlate what happened next with that story I have that you read about Raoul.
Mhm.
It was at that point when we were in the air, when it started to throw smoke or oil, he believed that we were going to be shot down because there was a Luftwaffe base just west of where we were. And his feeling was,
Now, why you mentioned who he was? Who was Raoul?
well, Raoul was an 11-year-old boy working for the Belgium Underground. And it was his job, if he saw any Allied airplanes crash and he could get to the survivors, if there were survivors, he was supposed to hide them in the woods, which he was very familiar with. And then at night, come back with adult members of the Underground, and they would try to get the airmen back to England through the Underground escape organizations. When he first saw us, he said to his friend who was riding with him, "Oh no, not again," because it was well known to them that just west of where we were, there was a Luftwaffe base. And every afternoon they had their aces up waiting for crippled airplanes, trying to get back to England. He said there would be a burst of machine gun fire, an explosion, sometimes a ball of fire, and every time dead and wounded men, and one more of their chances for freedom would disappear. He said, but this time it was different. He said, just as you were passing overhead, we heard like a small pop or a small explosion, and then this black smoke, he thought it was, coming out of the rear of the engine. And he became very excited that this airplane was going to land right in front of them. And he said to his friend, we'll be the first ones there. Maybe this time we can do something. This airplane is for us. He said, he later wrote to me and told me he was so excited he was trembling. When the airplane touched down, he and his friends started to run toward the airplane, but there was so much dust that they were afraid to get too close to the airplane because they were fearful of an explosion. And while they waited to make sure that there would be no explosion, the dust began to settle and he could see men climbing out of the airplane. And he started to run toward them, and when he got close enough where he could distinguish features, he stopped a second time, he says, and they were terrified. They sat down on their heels and they just put their hands on their heads and they watched, because the men climbing out of that airplane with all their strange garb and equipment, the oxygen masks hanging and the goggles and whatever equipment we had on, he says, you look like Martians. This is an 11-year-old boy. Mm-hmm. And you were talking to each other in a language we could not understand. And we were afraid to go near you. So instead of doing what he was supposed to do, they just sat and they watched while we set what was left of the airplane on fire and started to run across the field toward the woods. He said, and as you were running toward the woods, the Germans arrived on motorcycles with sidecars and they began shooting at you. And we saw you all fall flat on the ground and the Germans come up and capture you. For 50 years thereafter, the occurrence of that day haunted that young boy, later, of course, a man. The feeling, he experienced severe feelings of guilt all his life for not having done what he was supposed to do that day, namely hide us in the woods. Mm-hmm. Did we all die because he didn't do what he was supposed to do? He felt that he had killed us. He could never get it out of his mind. Anyway, when he grew up, he too became a pilot in the Belgian Air Force, an F-16 pilot, and he rose to the rank of a colonel in the Belgian Air Force. And in 1994, they found us through the use of the internet. When we got on the ground, after setting the airplane on fire, we started to run, before we did, we took a look at the two engines that had initially been on fire. And to our amazement, we found that there was a row of 50 caliber machine gun bullet holes through the bottom of both engines. And the Americans were the only ones that used 50 caliber machine guns. The Germans were using 20 millimeter cannon. So apparently what had happened, as the enemy fighters were passing through our formation, some gunner shooting at the enemy fighters had one of these situations where, oh, I'm sorry, you know,
You hit your airplane.
and hit our airplane. And I never had any ill feelings toward this person, whoever he is, because I'm alive today.
Mm-hmm.
10 minutes later, I might have been killed. The next mission, we might have been killed.
Mm-hmm.
We had some pretty hard times, but we're alive. And The Germans, when they captured us, they brought us to a pig pen. And we could tell it was a pig, it was like a corral. Long logs on fence posts in the ground. And it was full of pig droppings and slop all over the place. And we were so exhausted, we just sat down in it with our backs against the railing. It was like 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and we had been airborne at sunrise that morning. And it had been a really rough day. And then maybe we were there for 15 minutes or so, and then German officers started to arrive. And one of the officers wanted to know who the commanding officer was. So still sitting in the pig slop with my back against the railing, and I didn't even stand up, I said, I am. And the conversation was through one of the German guards who spoke some English. And this German walked over to where I was, and he stood in front of me for a minute looking down at me, and then he kicked out with his foot, and he caught me a glancing blow, because I dodged, and he caught me a glancing blow on the side of my face. And while it did not hurt too badly, it stung, and I could feel my face getting wet, and I put my hand in my pocket, take out a handkerchief to wipe it, and as I reached in my pocket, he reached for his Luger pistol at his hip, and he pulled his pistol out, and I thought he was going to shoot me. Instead, he waved it toward the entrance of the pig sty, and the German who spoke some English said, "You will let us go." So I got up and I walked out of the pig sty, and I started to walk with this German officer and the one who spoke a little English and a couple of other German guards. And I thought they were taking me out of the sight of witnesses and that they were going to shoot me. And it became obvious to me after walking a little way, they're bringing me to what's left of the airplane. And they brought me down to where the airplane was, and to my surprise, the fire which we started by igniting parachutes in the body of the airplane had burned from the tail up to the wings, and then the fire had gone out. When it reached the wings with the gas tanks and all the fuel pumps and everything in that part of the fuselage where you'd think it would blow up, the fire had gone out. So the front part of the airplane was still intact, and so this German who spoke some English says, "Why no guns?" He wanted to know why there were no guns on the airplane. So I told him we were on a training mission in England and we became lost. And I doubt that he believed it. Mm-hmm. And then his next question, and probably the main reason why they brought me to the airplane, was, why is the airplane go tick, 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 tick? They thought there was a bomb on it. And having just kicked me in the face, I wasn't about to tell them that the ticking noise was the top gun turret in the pilot's compartment, which when the switch is left on, that turret ticks. It goes tick, 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 tick. But they thought it was a bomb. So I told them I didn't know what the ticking was. So they wanted to know who would know. So I said mechanic would know. I'm not a mechanic. So they wanted to know which of the prisoners was the mechanic. So I said, oh, he's not here. The mechanic is in England. So they became angry. And they wanted me to go in what was left of the airplane. And this German who spoke some English said, you will go in and sit in the pilot seat where we can see you. And they moved back maybe 30 feet or so, and they could see maybe this much of me from the shoulders and the head and so forth. And I was thinking how stupid they were, that I wish I had hidden a gun in the cockpit, but I didn't have one. And but before I got into the airplane, when they first told me to get into it, I hesitated because I felt that the fire had just gone out. There might still be embers glowing near the fuel tanks, and this thing might go up, might explode. So I hesitated, and one of the guards who was standing behind me gave me a shot in the back with the butt of his rifle. And I fell to the ground, and I got up, and it felt like my back, it still hurts. They broke some of the little bones in the spine. Anyway, so I climbed into what was left of the airplane. I sat there maybe for 20 minutes, a half hour, I don't know how long, until the ticking stopped, and then they let me come out. I guess the batteries must have run down, and the ticking stopped. I did not know at the time. I learned later in 1994 in Raoul's letter to me, after he located me, that the community planned an ambush of the Germans when they took us away. They were going to try to liberate us. And he said, but they moved you away too quickly for us to be able to operate with any degree of security. So they were unable to do that. I guess that was the only physical maltreatment that I received. I mean, there was lack of food. When I was shot down, I weighed about 170 pounds. When I was liberated, I weighed 100 pounds, and they brought us by ambulance train on stretchers to Camp Lucky Strike in France. And of course, the death march out of Saigon was a very difficult ordeal. And there were a million little adventures. I mean, as I think about it, the book is full of these adventures and things that happened, too numerous really to just talk about.
Did they ever ask if any of your crew or you were Jewish?
Well,
or did they just look at dog tags? Or
when we were in prison camp in Saigon, at one time they were trying to find out who the Jewish prisoners were. And they never succeeded. I had a couple of nasty experiences. I was in a room with about 24 men, I guess there were, and 3 knew that I was Jewish, my crew members. My co-pilot, navigator, and bombardier knew I was Jewish. And the other 20 or so men were American officers of varying ranks, and bombardiers, pilots, and navigators. That's all that were in this camp. And they are men who I am certain, if we had been back in the States, we would have gone out double dating, we would have been friends, we would have played poker together and maybe gone to the bar together and so forth. We were bombarded in camp with anti-Semitic literature. The Germans published some newspapers in English, and it was just full of anti-Semitic propaganda. And after we'd been in prison camp for a while, and these men had been subjected to all this anti-Semitism, and being certain that there were no Jews present. It started very slowly. You know, the German, the Tsar and so wrong, the goddamn Jews this, and the goddamn Jews that. And I stayed out of these conversations. I just stayed out of them. As soon as they start talking anything about religion or Judaism or anything, I became interested in the book I was reading. And the three men argued with the other 20 about how wrong they were, how immoral it was to be saying the things they were saying, and how contrary it was to what we were fighting for, and so forth. And after a little while, these three became known as the Jew lovers. When they would walk into the room, oh, here come the Jew lovers. And it was a very difficult time for me. And, but I felt that I could not say anything or do anything because my life hung in the balance. And so that was a difficult situation. And there are a million stories that I could tell you.
How long, well, you were there 11 months.
11 months.
How were you finally liberated?
Well, eventually, after we marched from Sagan in Poland, partway to Nuremberg, and then they took us on these 40-8 cars, boxcars, to Nuremberg. Time up?
No.
If they took us to Nuremberg in these boxcars, we spent about, I guess maybe close to 3 months at Nuremberg. And then we marched from, as the American armies looked like they were going to liberate Nuremberg, they marched us out a second time. But this time it was spring, and the weather was good, and the Germans were much kinder because I guess they figured the war was lost. And we marched to a town called Mosburg, about 10 miles north of Munich. And this time we marched all the way. And we were put in a prison camp, a tent city prison camp at Mosburg. Hundreds, maybe 100,000 prisoners there from all over Germany. That's where they eventually concentrated. And we lived in tents. And then we were there a short time, maybe a couple of weeks. And we could hear gunfire getting louder each day as the battles drew closer. And eventually General Patton himself came right through the front gate of the prison camp. Pearl handle revolvers on his hip. And the front gate came down upon the impact of the tank. And within, I guess, maybe 30 or 40 minutes, a truckload of white bread arrived in that camp. And it tasted like cake. It was. And then they started to feed us, but of course the amount of food we were given was limited. Of course, overeating, you know, we could have done a lot of damage to ourselves.
How do you think your military experience changed or affected your life?
Oh, it affected my life very much so. When I got out of service, I tried to get a job with the airlines, flying for one of the airlines. And there were many, many pilots, 4-engine pilots, coming out of service at that time. And when I applied to the airlines for a flying job, I was told, well, geez, you have all the qualifications. but you're not current. You haven't flown in a year. And every one of them told me, why don't you sign up for another tour, get current again, and come back and see us. Well, having just come out of prison camp, I wasn't ready to sign up again for another tour. And I went to work for the Federal Aviation Administration. So, had I not been in service, I certainly would not have worked for the FAA. And I worked for the FAA for 30 years. And I had many jobs with them, from some flying early on to air traffic control. I became at one time what they called an analysis officer. I would investigate whenever there was an airplane accident or a near accident, near mid-air collision, or some important operation that didn't go the way it was supposed to go. It was my job to analyze what happened, why it happened, how we can prevent the recurrence of the incident. And I would chair, if there were disciplinary actions involved, I was chairman of the review board and so forth. And it was important to investigate these things because they have to, when there was a mistake made or an error, it had to be corrected so that it didn't happen again, because there's a great deal of liability on the part of the government.
We're out of film.
All right, after you were discharged, did you use the GI Bill at all?
No.
Did you use the 5220 Club?
Maybe for a couple of weeks.
Did you join any veterans organizations? Are you a member of any organizations?
I have never joined a veterans organization until about a year ago. I was purchasing an automobile for my wife, and I was in automobile dealers, and I was discussing with the salesman the operation of the engine and stuff. My wife wasn't interested. She liked the looks, and she was ready to buy it. And she walked away, and she walked into the waiting room, and there was a couple in the waiting room waiting to speak to the same salesman that I was dealing with. And so my wife and this couple began to speak with each other, and he mentioned that he was a prisoner of war. And my wife says, "Oh, my husband was a prisoner of war." And they talked for a few minutes, and then I walked into the waiting room. And as soon as I walked in, he grabbed me by the lapels of the jacket I was wearing. He says, "I understand you were a prisoner of war." I said, "Yes." Well, he wouldn't let go of me. He says, you don't belong to the American ex-POW organization." I said, "No." He says, "Well, you have to join them."
Or I won't let go.
Well, it was the funniest thing. So I finally said I would come to a meeting. And so I did. He contacted me. "We're having a meeting on this and this date." And I drove out to Northport to the VA hospital where they meet. And I went to a meeting, and I found a group of elderly gentlemen like myself, and an interesting group, and I joined the organization. But that's the only veterans.
How about the 8th Air Force?
What about them?
They have that historical group. You've never joined that?
Never joined anything.
Well, boy, you're the first one I think we've heard of that didn't.
Never joined anything.
Okay. Did you
Stay in contact with
that's
any of your crew members?
Well, when I are you recording?
yes.
When I arrived home, I was ill for a considerable length of time. I could not retain food. There were psychological problems in which I have no recollection, for example, of the first year after returning home. My wife relates occurrences to me.
Now, were you married? Or?
No, I was not married at the time. I got married in 46, and I arrived home in 45. But no recollection of that first year at home. And then I began to work for the FAA, and I was busy working, raising a family, and I really did not even know whether my crew members had survived the war. In 1994, when I was found by Lowell, with the information he had and my knowledge of what part of the country they came from, I was able to locate and talk to all of the members of my crew. All 10 had survived and gotten home.
And all 10 were still living?
There were 9 of us still alive. 9 of us were still alive. And the following year, in 1995, we had a reunion in Florida. And I think 7 of us went to it. And we sat around a table in a hotel bar with our wives, and each one of us related what happened on the day when we got shot down. Like I just read to you. There were 7 different stories. You would never recognize the details as being from the same occurrence. The amazing thing that came out of that meeting that day was that one of the wives, who had been married to her husband for over 40 years, never knew that he had been an airman, that he had been shot down, or that he had been a prisoner of war. He had never been able to speak about it. I found out also that several of the men had never been in an airplane since that day. Would never get back into an airplane. Never went any place. So those were interesting things. And of course the trips to Belgium.
Now, did any of the other crew members go over there for that?
Well, on the first trip, I went over with my wife and the radio operator and his wife and the navigator, who had had the nervous breakdown when we were hit, and his wife. What happened that day when he had the nervous breakdown was never mentioned. In fact, I have minimized it in the book by saying he went into shock. I mean, he just went totally to pieces. And but there was no purpose served by emphasizing it. I had another career after I left the FAA. I don't know if you're interested. Rather unusual. I ended up working for a company that manufactures very high-tech scientific instruments. And I was hired by them to establish an international sales organization. They were a domestic corporation. They wanted to go international. And I was hired to find and establish a sales organization around the world. And I worked for them for about 12 years, at the end of which time they were in business all over the world, and I had traveled all over the world. It was a great job.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you very much for your interview.
Okay.
Thank you.